In the middle of the 14th century, the streets of Florence did not echo with the sounds of the High Renaissance, but with the frantic tolling of church bells and the hushed whispers of ruin. The city had become the beating heart of European commerce, yet its foundations were built on a precarious arrangement of paper and promises. Within the stone palazzos of the Via de' Bardi, men who had once dictated the terms of war and peace to the monarchs of Christendom sat in silence, watching the ink dry on ledgers that no longer balanced. This was not merely the failure of a business, but the collapse of a world order. The fall of the Bardi and Peruzzi families remains the most significant financial catastrophe of the Middle Ages, a story of how the pursuit of absolute power eventually demands a price that no bank, however vast, can ever truly pay. Long before the Medici rose to prominence, the Bardi and Peruzzi were the undisputed titans of the Mediterranean. They did not simply lend money, they engineered the logistics of an entire continent. To understand their influence, one must look past the gold florins and into the complex web of trade they managed across thousands of miles. From the wool markets of England to the grain fields of Sicily and the spice ports of the Levant. These Florentine families created the first truly global infrastructure. They operated on a scale that dwarfed the kingdoms they served, utilizing a network of branches that functioned as a shadow government. Their agents were more than clerks. They were diplomats, spies, and architects of the status quo, moving capital through letters of credit that bypassed the physical dangers of the road. The rise of the Bardi was a study in methodical expansion. By the early 1300s, they were the primary financiers of the papacy, a position that granted them not only immense wealth, but a spiritual legitimacy that shielded them from the common stains of usury. This relationship with the Holy See allowed them to collect tithes across Europe, funneling the wealth of the church into their own coffers before redistributing it as high-interest loans. They were the essential intermediaries of the divine and the secular, turning prayer into capital. As their influence grew, they became indispensable to the crown of England, a partnership that would eventually provide both their greatest triumphs and their ultimate undoing. The Peruzzi family followed a similar trajectory, though they were often seen as the more cautious of the two giants. They were masters of the grain trade, ensuring that the burgeoning cities of Italy did not starve during years of poor harvest. This control over the food supply gave them a leverage that went beyond the financial. When a king needed to feed an army or a city needed to survive a siege, it was the Peruzzi who held the keys to the granaries. Together with the Bardi, they formed a duopoly that effectively managed the liquidity of the Western world. They believed they were too vital to fail, a sentiment that has echoed through the corridors of finance for centuries. Yet they forgot that their debtors held the ultimate power of the sword. The tension began to tighten during the reign of Edward III of England. To the Florentines, Edward was a lucrative investment, a young and ambitious monarch who required vast sums to assert his claim to the French throne. This was the inception of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that would demand resources on a scale previously unimaginable. The Bardi and Peruzzi saw in Edward a client who could grant them exclusive rights to the English wool trade, the most valuable commodity in Northern Europe. They began to pour gold into the English treasury, financing the glittering armor, the longbows, and the mercenary contracts that would soon devastate the fields of France. For years, the arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. The Florentine bankers received royal protection, tax, exemptions, and the prestige of being the king's merchants. However, the sheer volume of the debt began to distort the reality of the bank's balance sheets. They were no longer just lenders. They were stakeholders in a war that had no end in sight. The capital they were deploying did not belong to them alone. It was the accumulated savings of Florentine citizens, the dowries of daughters, and the pensions of veterans. The banks had become a reservoir for the entire city's wealth, and that reservoir was being drained into the mud of Flanders and the English Channel. As the 1330s drew to a close, the financial pressure became an audible hum in the markets of Florence. The Bardi and Peruzzi had tied their survival to a single outcome: an English victory that would result in the seizure of French wealth. But war is rarely so predictable. Edward's campaigns were expensive and indecisive, and the French Navy began to disrupt the very trade routes the bankers relied upon. To recoup their losses, in London, the king's advisors began to whisper that the debt to the Italians had become an intolerable burden. The gratitude of a monarch is a fleeting thing, and it often vanishes at the exact moment the bill becomes due. The first cracks appeared not in England, but in the internal politics of Florence. The city-state was embroiled in its own costly conflicts, attempting to purchase the city of Lucca to secure its territorial ambitions. To fund this, the government turned to the great banks, demanding loans that the Bardi and Peruzzi could no longer easily provide. The liquidity that had once flowed like a river was beginning to stagnate. Panic is a slow-moving fire until it reaches the heart of a city, and by 1342, the people of Florence began to sense that the great palazzos were hollow. The perceived invincibility of the Bardi was their only true collateral, and that perception was beginning to fray. The escalation reached its breaking point when Edward III took a calculated and devastating step. Facing a bankrupt treasury and a mounting pile of IOUs, the King of England did what no merchant could ever do. He simply stopped paying. In 1345, he formally repudiated his debts, effectively wiping the Bardi and Peruzzi off the map of European finance. The amounts were staggering, totaling over 1 million gold florins. In a single stroke of a pen, the wealth of decades was annulled. The news traveled back to Florence with the speed of a plague, and the reaction was instantaneous. The scene in the streets was one of controlled desperation, turning into chaotic fury. The Bardi and Peruzzi were forced to suspend payments to their own depositors. Thousands of families realized in an afternoon that their life savings had been spent on English arrows that had already been fired. The social contract of Florence shattered. The banks were not just private entities, they were the infrastructure of the state, and their collapse triggered a systemic failure that brought the city to its knees. Riots broke out, and the once venerated bankers found themselves barricaded inside their homes, listening to the shouts of the very people who had once bowed as they passed. The failure of the Bardi and Peruzzi was not a sudden explosion, but a long, agonizing contraction that reshaped the psychology of the Western world. To truly grasp the magnitude of their collapse, one must look at the sheer scale of the void they left behind. When the English crown defaulted, it was as if a central sun had vanished from a solar system, leaving the planets to spin into the darkness of a cold, unfinanced reality. The Florentine florin, once the stable dollar of the Middle Ages, began to fluctuate wildly as the markets realized that the gold backing it was tied up in empty promises and distant battlefields. In the years following 1345, the city of Florence underwent a fundamental transformation. The Bardi family, once so numerous and powerful that they occupied an entire district of the city, found themselves the targets of a new and biting resentment. The common people, who had seen their modest savings evaporated by the bank's gambles, no longer viewed the great palazzos as symbols of civic pride. Instead, they saw them as monuments to a reckless greed that had mortgaged the city's future to a foreign king. The physical landscape of the city changed as the Bardi were forced to sell off their ancestral lands, and the great towers they had built to touch the heavens were shortened by order of a populist government that sought to humble the old aristocracy. The Peruzzi suffered a more quiet, but no less devastating, erasure. They had been the intellectual weight of the Florentine banking world, known for their meticulous record-keeping and their deep understanding of the grain markets. Their failure meant more than just a loss of money. It was the collapse of a data network. Without the Peruzzi's agents reporting on the harvests of Sicily and North Africa, the price of bread in Florence became volatile and unpredictable. The stability that the great banks had provided, a stability that allowed for the growth of art, philosophy, and urban life, was replaced by a persistent sense of dread. The tension within the city walls eventually boiled over into the Ciompi Revolt, where the disenfranchised workers of the wool industry, the very men whose labor had created the bankers' wealth, rose up to demand a voice. They had seen the Bardi and Peruzzi live in unimaginable luxury while the city's economy was healthy, only to be cast into poverty the moment the royal debts went sour. The uprising was a direct consequence of the financial vacuum. Without the banks to provide the credit that kept the looms moving, the social fabric of Florence simply unraveled. The era of the fat people, the wealthy merchant class, was temporarily checked by the rage of the lean people who had nothing left to lose. Across the English Channel, King Edward III remained largely indifferent to the suffering he had caused in the shadows of the Duomo. For the English monarchy, the default was a masterstroke of political pragmatism. By wiping away his debts to the Italians, Edward was able to continue his campaigns in France with a clean slate, turning toward domestic lenders and the growing wealth of the English merchant wool staplers. He had used the Florentines to bridge the gap between a feudal economy and a modern war machine, and once the bridge had served its purpose, he burned it without a second thought. This maneuver established a precedent that would haunt international finance for centuries: the realization that a sovereign nation can never truly be held to account by a private creditor. The Bardi and Peruzzi had operated under the illusion that they were equals to the princes they funded. They dressed like royalty, they negotiated like diplomats, and they married into the minor nobility. But the collapse revealed the rigid hierarchy of the medieval world. No matter how many millions of florins a merchant controlled, he remained a commoner in the eyes of the law and the sword. This hard-learned lesson became the foundation of the next century's economic thought. The survivors of the crash realized that the only way to protect wealth from the whims of a king was to weave it into the very structure of the state itself, or to diversify so broadly that no single monarch could cause a total collapse. The aftermath of the default transformed the landscape of Florence from a city of boundless ambition into a fortress of caution. As the Bardi and Peruzzi branches across Europe shuttered their windows, the ripple effect dismantled the livelihoods of thousands. It was not just the wealthy who suffered, but the weavers, the dyers, and the local artisans who relied on the credit the banks provided to purchase raw materials. The collapse revealed a terrifying truth about the new era of finance: that in an interconnected world, the failure of a giant does not just ruin the owners, it poisons the entire ecosystem. The city's Republican government, once the pride of Italy, was thrown into a series of coups and counter-coups as the starving populace demanded accountability for the vanished gold. Within the ruined counting houses, the families attempted to salvage what remained of their dignity. The Bardi, despite their bankruptcy, remained a formidable name, but their spirit was broken. They had once held the keys to the kingdom of Naples and the grain of Sicily, but now they were forced to beg for tax exemptions from the very city council they had once dominated. The Peruzzi, perhaps more spiritually wounded by the betrayal of the English crown, turned inward. Their ledgers from this period are haunting documents, filled with meticulous notes of debts that would never be paid, and assets that had vanished into the fog of the Atlantic. They had learned that a king's word is a commodity with a rapidly depreciating value. This period of stagnation was further darkened by the arrival of the Black Death only a few years later. The plague found a Florence that was already economically malnourished and socially fractured. Had the great banks still been at the height of their power, some historians suggest the city might have had the resources to better manage the catastrophe. Instead, the pestilence moved through a population already broken by financial ruin. The combination of the bank failures and the plague effectively ended the first great age of Italian capitalism, clearing the stage for a more cynical and calculated form of banking that would define the next century. The legacy of the Bardi and Peruzzi is etched into the very stones of Florence, yet it is a legacy of what might have been. They pioneered the tools of modern finance, double-entry bookkeeping, letters of exchange, and the diversification of risk, yet they fell victim to the most ancient of traps, the hubris of proximity to power. They believed that by making themselves indispensable to the state, they would become immune to its whims. They failed to realize that to a monarch in debt, a creditor is not a partner, but a problem to be solved. The story of the Bardi and Peruzzi is ultimately a tragedy of timing. They were the first to attempt a global financial system, but they lacked the legal protections and the institutional safeguards to survive the volatility of the age. They were pioneers in a lawless frontier, building cathedrals of credit on shifting sands. When we look at the quiet, sun-drenched streets of Florence today, it is easy to forget that these stones were once the site of a financial apocalypse that nearly ended the dream of modern commerce. The silence that followed their fall was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a world learning to be cynical. To truly understand the depth of the Bardi's descent, one must consider their involvement in the politics of the Kingdom of Naples. For decades, the Bardi were the financial spine of the Angevin dynasty, managing the kingdom's vast agricultural exports. They had effectively commoditized the bread of the Mediterranean. When the English default triggered a global credit crunch, the Bardi attempted to call in their Neapolitan debts, only to find that the southern Italian nobility was just as unwilling to pay as the English king. They were trapped between a northern sovereign who refused to acknowledge his debts and a southern nobility that saw the Florentines as alien parasites to be purged. The Peruzzi, meanwhile, found themselves entangled in the complex politics of the papal curia. While the Bardi handled the kings, the Peruzzi often handled the bishops. Their network of agents was so vast that they often knew the results of papal elections before the white smoke rose. But this proximity to the divine did not save them from the material reality of bankruptcy. When the Peruzzi firm finally shuttered its doors in 1343, 2 years before the Bardi's final gasp, the shock was felt as far away as the markets of Bruges and the ports of the Black Sea. It was the first time in European history that a private business failure had caused a continental recession. The resulting power vacuum in Florence allowed for the rise of the new men, merchants who had not been tied to the old banking houses. These men were less interested in the grand schemes of kings and more focused on local stability and defensive wealth. They watched as the Bardi were stripped of their voting rights and their palazzos were converted into government offices. The fall of the old guard was a brutal lesson in the transience of financial might. The Florentine Republic, once an experiment in merchant democracy, became more insular and paranoid, fearing that any concentration of wealth would inevitably lead to another catastrophe. Looking back through the lens of history, The story of the Bardi and Peruzzi is not merely a chronicle of bad loans or royal betrayal. It is a reflection on the inherent fragility of trust. These men built an empire on the belief that the world was governed by rules and that even kings were bound by the sanctity of a contract. They discovered, at the cost of everything, that when the stakes are high enough, power recognizes no law but its own survival. The silent ledgers in the Florentine archives serve as a permanent reminder that the most sophisticated systems are only as strong as the integrity of those who move the money. The final irony of the Bardi and Peruzzi story lies in the sheer anonymity of their end. Unlike the Medici, whose names are synonymous with the artistic flowering of the Renaissance, the Bardi and Peruzzi are remembered primarily as a footnote in economic history. They were the architects of a system that outlived them, leaving behind a world where money could move at the speed of thought, even if the men who created that movement were ultimately crushed by its momentum. They paved the way for the modern world, not with their successes, but with the spectacular, illuminating nature of their failure. The void left by the Bardi and Peruzzi was not merely a matter of missing gold, but a fracture in the very concept of historical progress. Before their fall, there was a sense of a rising tide in Europe, an era where the merchant's ledger seemed poised to civilize the knight's sword. The collapse of these houses signaled a return to a more primitive, fragmented reality. In the absence of Florentine credit, the grand projects of the 14th century slowed to a crawl. Great cathedrals stood unfinished for generations, their skeletons of stone serving as silent witnesses to the day the money stopped flowing. The ambition that had once spanned from the wool staples of the Cotswolds to the spice markets of Alexandria was replaced by a desperate local survivalism. This contraction had a profound impact on the intellectual life of the era. The great universities, which had thrived on the mobility of students and the circulation of capital, found themselves increasingly isolated. The cosmopolitan world of the early 1300s, where a letter of credit could be cashed in almost any major city in Christendom, was replaced by a world of barriers and borders. The failure of the Bardi and Peruzzi taught a bitter lesson to the scholars and jurists of the time, that the laws of commerce were only as strong as the ruler who chose to enforce them. This realization fueled a new wave of political thought, one that moved away from the ideal of a unified Christian empire and toward the cold, hard reality of the sovereign state. In the decades following the crash, the survivors of the families lived in a state of perpetual shadow. The Bardi, once the personal bankers to the Pope, were reduced to minor players in the local silk trade. Their name, which had once opened the gates of royal palaces, now served as a warning to cautious investors. Yet, in their descent, they preserved something essential. They kept their records. These ledgers, saved from the fires of riots and the damp of neglected cellars, became the blueprints for the future of European banking. They contained the DNA of every modern financial instrument, from the bill of exchange to the concept of the holding company. Their failure was the expensive laboratory in which the rules of modern capitalism were first tested and refined. As the 14th century drew to a close, a new figure began to emerge from the wreckage of the old order. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, the patriarch of the family that would eventually rule Florence, was a man who understood the Bardi's failure in his very marrow. He did not build his bank on the unstable foundations of royal vanity. Instead, he focused on the burgeoning middle class, the guild, members, and the smaller princely states that lacked the power to simply declare their debts void. The Medici success was built on the wreckage of the Bardi ambition, a phoenix of cold calculation rising from the ashes of a more romantic and more reckless era of finance. The ultimate tragedy of the Bardi and Peruzzi was that they were men of the future living in a world that was still firmly rooted in the past. They envisioned a world of borderless trade and objective value, but they were trapped in a world of feudal honor and absolute monarchs. They attempted to tame the lions of Europe with paper chains, only to find that when the lion is hungry, the chain is nothing but a snack. Their story is a reminder that the tools of progress are always at the mercy of the human impulse for power. The gold of the Bardi did not disappear into the earth. It was spent on the walls of castles and the blood of soldiers, transformed from a liquid asset of peace into a solid monument to war. When we walk through the modern financial districts of London, New York, or Frankfurt, we are walking through a world that the Bardi and Peruzzi first imagined. Every time a digital transaction clears across an ocean, it is an echo of a Florentine clerk's quill moving across parchment in 1320. We have built better safeguards, we have created international laws, and we have established central banks to prevent the kind of systemic collapse that destroyed the Florentine giants. But the fundamental tension remains. The struggle between the creditor and the sovereign, between the merchant's ledger and the ruler's sword, is a story that has no final chapter. The Bardi and Peruzzi were the first to fly too close to the sun of absolute power. Their wings were made of paper, held together by the wax of human trust. When the heat of the 100 Years' War grew too intense, the wax melted, and they fell into the sea of history. They left behind no great statues, no conquered territories, and no dynasties that survived into the modern age. What they left was a lesson, written in the red ink of bankruptcy, that wealth is a shadow, and power is the only thing that casts it. In the end, they were not just bankers who financed kings. They were the men who proved that a king's debt is the most dangerous asset in the world. The final reflection on their lives is found not in their wealth, but in their endurance. Despite the riots, the plague, and the total loss of their fortunes, the families did not disappear. They became part of the fabric of Florence, their names woven into the minor history of a city that would soon change the world through art and philosophy. They learned to live without the burden of being the world's creditors. They found a quiet dignity in the wreckage, a testament to the human ability to survive even the total collapse of one's world. The story of the Bardi and Peruzzi is a story of a beginning, a middle, and a brutal end. But it is also a story of the persistence of the human spirit in the face of its own monumental failures.